From dark brotherhoods of assassins to magical cabals to coalitions of kings, factions can bring a ton of fun and a ton of flavor to your setting. Designing a group of dozens or even thousands of people can seem daunting, but in my opinion, it's not actually that hard. Welcome back to World Building Praxis, where we are building a world from scratch for use as a D&D campaign setting. Last time, we developed our adventure's local area. And this time, we're going to hone in on that area and develop some of its finer elements. The aspects of our setting which our players will interact the most closely with. And we're starting with a fun one: factions. Designing factions is pretty fun, and I've found that it's not actually that dissimilar from designing a single character, with a few key changes. Interestingly enough, factions often end up being less complex than individual characters due to things like group polarization. There are several random tables which I use to help me when I'm designing factions, and we'll get to them eventually, but I rarely find myself truly starting from scratch. And that's because I usually have a pretty good idea of a few I want to include. A good place to start is a small group of classic D&D factions, the archetypes of which I think fit into many baseline D&D settings. The first I'll talk about is the Zhentarim, a criminal network which connects thieves' guilds and smugglers and other less than savory folk who want to amass wealth outside the bounds of the law. If you want to follow the D&D tradition, you can include the Zhentarim itself in your setting. Or you can simply design a faction which occupies the same niche. The next faction I'll mention is the Harpers. The Harpers are a chaotic good faction which fights evil from the shadows. They consist of decentralized cells which operate largely independently, and its main drawback is a real lack of power and resources. But it is a ton of fun to include in your setting. Another common faction archetype is what I'll call the 12th century Byzantine Empire analog. That's a bit of a mouthful. How about Byzantines for short? Because D&D assumes that your setting is a post-apocalyptic medieval fantasy, there is often a remnant of a past empire which is attempting to re-establish itself. These remnants depend on the ubiquity of their past power for relevance, often using the same name as the past empire, even if it is all but unrecognizable as the same entity. Factions like these are most often preoccupied with forging factions and alliances with local lords in an attempt to bring them back into the fold, hopefully paving the way towards another age of centralized power. The final sample faction I'll mention is a good old-fashioned death cult. Many have existed throughout the history of D&D, but they all function kind of the same way. A nasty deity or demon wants to spread death and destruction, and so they make pacts with mortals. Pacts which grant power, wealth, or something else to cultists in return for furthering the baddie's misanthropic agenda. Death cults are pretty adaptable to any setting. Just plug in one of your evil deities and you're good to go. None of these sample factions are required, but I think pretty much all of them can fit into pretty much any setting. The first faction we design in this video, we will make totally from scratch, which, as I mentioned, I rarely do, but it will be a good way of acquainting ourselves with the different aspects we need to design for each faction. I'm not a huge fan of alignments when it comes to characters, but when it comes to amorphous entities like deities or factions, for example, I think they work just fine. On the occasions I do roll alignments, I usually use this monstrosity of a table, but to keep it simple, we'll stick to this one. And as always, remember that if you're rolling something for your setting with a table, you are not beholden to the dice. The tables are there to jumpstart your imagination, not to constrain you. Our first faction will be a fun one, as we've rolled neutral evil. Next up, we're going to figure out how large the faction is. We're doing this early because several of our faction's other traits will depend on its size. The word faction can mean a lot of things, from small collections of local farmers to multi-kingdom alliances. And this variety is reflected in our faction size table, a two-step table which can result in sizes ranging from 4 to 44,000 members. You'll see that this table also includes size modifiers, which we can ignore for now. Our first faction happens to be rather large, being 12,000 members strong. This means that, since Praxis is a very politically devolved setting, this faction is one of the most powerful entities on the continent. The next thing we're going to roll is our faction's publicity. I'm using this word to refer specifically to how public a faction is about its actions. Some factions, like secret societies, have a vested interest in remaining as private as possible. while others have a vested interest in making as much noise as possible, like a group of citizens protesting a new coal mine or a religious sect trying to increase its numbers. Our faction has rolled a 2, so it's rather secretive. How secretive can a faction with 12,000 members be? That's what our next table is for. The renown table reflects how much the average commoner knows about the faction, and is weighted by the faction's size and publicity. This table reflects that a very large faction which wants to be secretive is going to have trouble doing so, while a very small faction which wants to make a big name for itself will have trouble also. When rolling our faction's renown, we will refer back to its size modifier, as well as its publicity, and add them to our roll. A few dice rolls later, and we can see that our not-so-secret faction is an 8 out of 10 on the renown scale, meaning it's actually rather prominent. This means that even though it would rather stay in the shadows, most people know about it anyway. A huge evil faction which everyone knows about, but no one talks about, is some really good writing fuel. Next, we want to know our faction's age. This roll is really going to depend on your setting, but here are the numbers I'm using. You can see that they pretty heavily favor the recent, which is because Praxis exists in a state of political disrepair. All of that said, we have rolled an age of about 400 years. This means that not only is this faction one of the most powerful and well-known on the continent, it's also one of the oldest. If it fits into your setting, you can also give your faction a patron, a deity or deities to which members might pray or sacrifice. The gods in my settings are very active, so most factions are going to have a patron. With the bones of our faction in place, it's time to give it some life. Let's start by rolling its purpose. This is another multi-part roll with the first D6 pointing to one of these tables. Our faction happens to have been founded for the purpose of knowledge with a focus on a particular craft. In a vacuum, this could refer to a long-standing academy or college, but with our previous roles in mind, I have another idea. An incredibly powerful, cutthroat guild. A guild which jealously, and sometimes violently, protects trade secrets, intimidates competitors, bribes politicians, and so on and so forth. Which trade could warrant such a powerful guild? Well, we're in luck, because our setting has already mentioned a few prominent trades, and the one that caught my eye was the tin mining and smithing industry in Edgemere, the most populous city on the continent. On its surface, tin isn't the most exciting metal, but I have the advantage of Principles of Shamanism, a third-party resource which I happen to write, which outlines material components for every spell as of 2023 or so. So I know that using this system, the spell message relies on tin, and the spell sending relies on pewter, an alloy of tin. So this guild isn't just controlling the flow of tin across the continent, it's controlling the means of communication across the continent. That is an industry which warrants a giant, unscrupulous faction. Next, we'll tackle the faction's beliefs. This quality is going to function pretty similarly to a character's ideal. I have a pretty good idea of our faction already, but if you're still in need of some inspiration, you can roll on this, my preferred ideal table. Our faction's beliefs are going to pretty clearly resemble an outcome of wealth or supremacy on this table, but I like to go into a little more depth. Here's what I came up with. I'm sure you're starting to see how creating a faction can resemble creating a character. Up next is our faction's mission. This one's going to function pretty similarly to a character's bond, its true motivation, something that will influence its every action and decision. Establishing a clear mission is going to help you in the future too, as it gives you a nice, concise bit of text to consult before you have the faction make a decision. Our guild's mission is to exert total control over tin mining, smithing, and distribution, thereby becoming the sole arbiter of remote communication on the continent. We're also going to decide our faction's reach, or how wide it spans geographically. There isn't a table for this one, seeing as it's going to depend so heavily on the faction's other traits as well as your setting. Seeing as this guild is massive and hell-bent on maintaining a continental monopoly, I think it's pretty safe to say its reach is continental. Even though the tin industry is based in Edgemere, I've decided that the guild's true headquarters lies in the port city of Shava's Harbor, a wretched hive of scum and villainy. We're also going to take note of our faction's influence, how much and what type of power it has. Needless to say, this guild's influence will be significant. Just like any character, our faction needs a flaw. There are plenty of resources you could use to roll a flaw for a character and then adapt it to a faction, but I like to let these arise organically. As far as the flaw for a aggressively monopolizing media giant, this one's pretty easy. A nearly ubiquitous hatred from everyone on the continent. Despite the faction's efforts to remain unsung, pretty much everybody knows about them, and pretty much everybody hates them. The last thing we'll design for our faction is a proxy, by which I mean an NPC who will function as an embodiment of the faction to the player party. A character who really embodies a lot of a faction's qualities can be a great way to leave an impression of it on our players. Also, if your players want to interact with a faction, they can just interact with the proxy. That way, they don't have to remember dozens of names. And neither do you. For now, we can just come up with a species and a name as well as their position, since most of our proxy's qualities are simply going to be those of the faction. Remember, these proxies are mostly there to let your players interact more easily with the faction, so I like to keep them pretty simple. If one of the proxies ends up becoming more important to the plot, we can flesh them out later. Finally, we can put the finishing touches on our faction, coming up with a name for it. I've decided on the Stanum Guild. Then, if we're feeling creative, we can design it a symbol. So there's our first faction done. One thing we always want to be doing while world building is keeping in mind everything we've built up to now. Not only does this allow us a chance to make sure everything is remaining cohesive, it also makes our job easier, as we can let the present be influenced by the past. So let's look back through our settings history and see if anything speaks to us. One of our setting's past empires, the Hevingvat, possessed powerful military technology in the form of magical body mods. We established that there is an order of monks whose mission is to seek out and sequester as many of these body mods as possible. This order is already a cool idea for a faction, but what if they had an evil counterpart? A faction hell-bent on amassing this technology with the dream of using it to fuel a bid for power. A faction known as the Takuma Society. Our evil tech collectors are going to be very secretive, but not infallible. Very few know of their existence, but a handful of perceptive information brokers have noticed that any Hevingvat magic items which find themselves in the black market are being snapped up almost immediately. This faction isn't going to be very large, but its power will be disproportionate to its size due to all the magical artifacts it's collected. Keeping with the theme of letting past world building influence future world building, let's take a look at Katafi. I mentioned last time that Katafi, the largest city in the Four Lakes region, was founded by Minotaurs. So I spent some time fleshing out Minotaur culture, which I'll go into in more detail in a later episode. But one thing I established is that our Hoven friends in this region are traditionally followers of Megizo the Spider, a neutral deity concerned with the work, or an individual's personal craft. So I've made our third faction reflect this, a largely Minotaur religious sect called the Eight-Spoked Wheel. Though the Wheel is a religious order full of paladins and clerics, it functions almost like a corps of engineers. Need a road built? Need a windmill refurbished? The Eight-Spoked Wheel will send some of its acolytes to handle it, provided your town is a donor to the temple, of course. The factions of our setting have begun to rack up a bit of a alignment imbalance, so let's mix some good in with the bad. Our next faction will borrow from one of the classic D&D examples I mentioned earlier, the Harpers. Although less covert than their classic D&D inspiration, the Raven's Nest resists the spread of evil and tyranny. Named after its patron deity, Korav the Crow, they uphold its values, resisting oppression with overwhelming force. Its current adversary is the mighty Stanum Guild, whose control seems to grow by the day. The Raven's Nest aims to redistribute the power of communication to the people. Unfortunately, they, like the rest of the continent, are becoming more dependent on the Guild's technology by the day. Of course, there is room in our setting for dozens of factions, but I think 4 is a great starting point for our local area. These forces all pulling in different directions injects even more tension into our setting. They also provide our players with organizations they could ally with, oppose, or even join. They also give us some great options for adding a B-plot to our adventure. Maybe the Raven's Nest is planning a raid on a tin shipment. Or the Takuma have heard reports of a newly discovered dungeon in the area, and have dispatched one of their most formidable procurers. Regardless, I think we can consider our settings factions, for now, complete. Thanks for watching, everybody. I know I said last time that this would be the last episode of the series, but The script was becoming unmanageably large, so I decided to cut it into 4 parts. Next up, we'll be designing a city. If you want to support me, you can do all the normal stuff down here at the bottom, or you can head over to the Patreon, where you can see the videos early for $1, or get your name in the credits for $5. See ya! They are there to help you jumpstart your imagination. You're not beholden to the dice.